Hello, I am Professor Shiladitya Rakshit. The module title is United Nations Human Settlement Program, or the UN Habitat. The United Nations Human Settlements Program, or UN Habitat, is a UN specialized agency charged with promoting socially and environmentally sustainable towns and cities. It also aims to provide adequate shelter for all and the coordination of urbanization and human settlement policy within the UN system. The UN Habitat's current agenda is set by its 2014-2019 strategic plans. This plan has set 7 focus areas for the organization's work. They are urban legislation, land and governance, urban planning and design, urban economy, urban basic services, housing and slum upgrading, risk reduction and rehabilitation, and research and capacity development. The first 4 areas have been emphasized as points of greater focus due to past neglect of these important issues. The UN Habitat has further identified gender equality, youth, partnership, climate change, capacity building and human rights as cross-cutting issues throughout all of these strategic goals. Apart from these, there are other important goals for the UN Habitat. They are known as the Millennium Development Goals. Improving the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers, and target 10 having the proportion of the population without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. So, in order to make sure that they get these resources and the 100 million people get upgraded to better housing. From a practical perspective, the UN Habitat acts as a project coordinator and broker of information on urbanization and global housing, water as well as sanitation. In particular, it designs, implements and manages urban initiatives and human settlement development projects, carries out research and facilitates the exchange of information, knowledge and best practices. And it acts as the focal point for human settlement matters within the UN system. Now, what are the learning outcomes of this module? Once we have discussed the module on introduction. To understand the challenges of organizations and the role of the UN Habitat in grappling with this issue. To understand the nature and institution of the UN Habitat. To assess its role as a mechanism for the protection of human rights. Now, let us look at the history of the UN Habitat. It is to be noted that the challenges of urbanization are of relatively recent concern among the international community. It is only in the past 50 years that countries began to recognize the need for sustainability in human settlements as process of rapid urbanization, particularly in the developing world, led to unprecedented growth, and cities struggled to provide expanded infrastructure that could meet the needs of those new inhabitants. And these were people living in very sordid conditions. Slums and poor living conditions are today a reality of daily life for a vast number of people. Serious UN action on housing and urbanization issues only began in the 1970s. On January 1st, 1975, the UN General Assembly established the first UN body to deal with the topic of urbanization, the United Nations Habitat and Human Settlements Foundation, which was known as the UNHHSF. The UNHHSF functioned under the umbrella of the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. Its mandate was to assist UN member states by providing capital and technical assistance for their national programs, these relating to urbanization and human settlement. The UNHHSF's budget, however, was quite low, and its ability therefore to take action was limited. In view of this, in 1976, the UN organized its first conference on the issue of urbanization. The conference was known as Habitat 1, was held in Vancouver, Canada. Habitat 1 led to the formation of two new bodies, the United Nations Commission on Human Settlements and intergovernmental body and the United Nations Center for Human Settlements, known as the Habitat, to serve as the executive secretariat of the Commission. The Habitat was also charged with managing UNHHSF's funds. Habitat, the precursor today as the UN Habitat, began operations way back in 1978. It is to be kept in mind that the Habitat struggled during its initial decades of operation due to lack of funding and a dearth of political support within the UN system. Indeed, it was not until 1996 that the organization experienced a revitalization that brought renewed attention and resources. In that year, the UN held its Habitat conference in Istanbul, Turkey, the primary objective of setting new goals for the new millennium. The Habitat 2 conference resulted in the production of the Habitat Agenda. Now, what was the Habitat Agenda? This was basically a document adopted by 171 countries, which contained over 100 new commitments on housing, urbanization and cities. This revitalization process continued in 2002 with the adoption by the General Assembly of Resolution, that is A56/206, which strengthened Habitat's mandate and elevated its status within the UN system. It elevated it in a manner that now the Habitat was looked at as a specialized agency. This promotion also came with a name change, and the organization has from then on been known as the UN Habitat. Resolution A/56/206 also streamlined the governance system with regard to urbanization and housing issues, merging UNHHSF, the Commission on Human Settlements and Habitat into the single agency UN Habitat. Since this revitalization and streamlining, UN Habitat has expanded its reach and influence. It is currently in the process of planning a third UN conference on housing and sustainable urban development. So, these are the two prime focuses. Habitat 3, which will take place in Quito, Ecuador in October 2016. The objective of Habitat 3 will be to chart new pathways for urban development in light of the post 2015 development agenda. Now, what about the institution? Let us look into it. The UN Habitat is headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. However, it also maintains regional offices for Africa, Arab states, Latin America and Asia that work to implement UN Habitat plans and programs at the regional level as well as country and project offices in a number of countries throughout the world. The UN Habitat is composed of three primary organs: the Governing Council, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, and the Secretariat. The UN Habitat's Governing Council is the new incarnation of the old Commission on Human Settlements. The intergovernmental decision, which is a decision making body that existed between 1978 and 2002. The Governing Council directs UN Habitat's activities. It meets every 2 years to approve the organization's budget and determines its programs and its goals for the future. The Governing Council is composed of 58 members elected by the UN's Economic and Social Council to 4 different year terms. The members are regionally balanced according to the UN norm, with 16 from African states, 13 from Asia and Pacific states, and 6 from Eastern European states, 10 from Latin American and Caribbean states, and 13 from Western European and other states. The Committee of Permanent Representatives represents the General Council at the UN Habitat Secretariat in Nairobi. It plays a supervisory role managing the Secretariat's activities between the biennial Governing Council meetings. It is to be kept in mind, the Secretariat is a new incarnation of the old Habitat organization. The Secretariat acts as the UN Habitat's executive organ, and what does it do? It implements the General Council's program, carrying out research activities and liaising with other UN agencies. All this is done in order to facilitate urbanization and human settlement work. The Secretariat composition is to be looked into. The Secretariat is made up of 7 branches, each of which is dedicated to the fulfillment of one of the 7 focus areas of the UN Habitat work as listed above. The Secretariat is led by an executive director, who is also an Under Secretary General of the United Nations. Since 2010, the UN Habitat's executive director is Joan Clos Mathieu, a former mayor of Barcelona. The UN Habitat's funding comes primarily from voluntary contributions. These contributions are by governmental and intergovernmental donors. The portion of regular budget is provided by the UN General Assembly. UN bodies, local authorities, private sectors, and multilateral organizations also provide funding for specific UN Habitat projects. Now, let us look into the UN Habitat's role as a forum for human rights. It is to be kept in mind that the human right to housing is one of the most basic human rights and is contained in a number of international and regional human rights treaties. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states in Article 25 that, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control." Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights ICE-SCR more expansively attests that, and it states that the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. It also ensures and tries to promote that states will take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this right, recognizing to this effect the essential importance of international cooperation based on free consent. Further to this, additional protections are included in many international and regional instruments, including, for example, the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, in other words, as an abbreviation CEDAW. Then there is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that is CRPD, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all migrant workers and members of their families. This is known as the ICRMW, the European Social Charter and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of Child, to name a very few. It is to be noted that not only the right to housing, but also the rights to water and sanitation are fundamentally entangled with urbanization. Not only urbanization, they cover housing and development issues as well. Though the rights to water and sanitation are not explicitly included in the ICE-SCR, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has interpreted Articles 11 and 12 securing this right. And it says that while securing this right to an adequate standard of living and the right to health, as including these rights within its scopes, legal entitlement rather than as an aid or charity. Now, this emphasizes the obligation of states rather than the goodwill of governments or private donors to ensure that individuals and communities can access shelter, water and sanitation sufficient for their needs and for themselves and their families. It justifies a focus on the needs of the most vulnerable, such as those living in extreme poverty, those who suffer social marginalization, persons with disabilities and members of minority groups. Furthermore, the rights to housing, water and sanitation approach envisions adequate housing as inseparable from other human rights. Not only in fact, but in reality, the principles such as non-discrimination, equality and accountability, and thus promotes a more holistic approach to these issues. Because of its status as a UN specialized agency with a focus on attaining adequate shelter for all, UN Habitat is a central agency for human rights, not only in theory, but in practice for human rights work with respect to the rights to housing, water and sanitation. All UN entities must abide by the UN Charter, which establishes human rights as a major institutional goal. It says that we, the peoples of the United Nations, determine to reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in equal rights of men and women and of nations, large and small. In this context, the UN Habitat works on issues such as improving the conditions of slum dwellers, ensuring adequate shelter and promoting sustainable human settlements and working for gender equality in human settlements. Its aim is to directly contributing to the fulfillment of every person's right to housing, water and sanitation. It is to be kept in mind that human rights form an integral part of UN Habitat's agenda. Paris 61 of the Istanbul Agreement, the program documented that issued from the Habitat II conference in 1996, identified the steps that governments must take to promote, protect and ensure the full and progressive realization of the rights to adequate housing, as well as access to water and sanitation. The Habitat Agenda, which set UN Habitat's goals following that conference, affirms that we, the states participating in the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements, Habitat II, are committed to a political, economic, environmental, ethical and spiritual vision of human settlements based on the principles of equality, solidarity, partnership, human dignity, respect and cooperation. We adopt the goals and principles of adequate shelter for all and sustainable human settlements development in an urbanizing world. We believe that attaining these goals will promote a more stable and equitable world that is free from injustice and conflict and will contribute to a just, comprehensive and lasting peace. We reaffirm our commitment to ensuring the full realization of the human rights which are set out in the international instruments and in particular in this context the right to adequate housing as set forth in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, taking into account that the right to adequate housing as included in the above mentioned instruments shall be realized progressively. We also reaffirm that all human rights, whether civil, cultural, economic, political and social, are universal, indivisible, interdependent and interrelated. In addition to including human rights principles in its governing documents, the UN Habitat has also taken specific steps to promote and protect human rights as part of its mandate. In 2002, for example, the UN Habitat began cooperating with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is known as the OHCHR, on the issue. And what was the issue? On the promotion, the progressive realization of housing rights under the United Nations Housing Rights Program. It also collaborates with the UN Development Group Human Rights Mainstreaming Mechanism, as well as the UN Special Rapporteurs on the right to adequate housing and the right to safe drinking water, and also the right to sanitation. In 2013, the Governing Council established the mainstreaming of human rights in UN Habitat, basically mainstreaming them in its work as a priority issue and included it in the 2014-2019 strategic plan. As UN Habitat explains, a human rights based approach is useful to its work because the challenges such as rising inequality and the prevalence of slums are symptoms of a larger deficit to respect human rights in cities. This is in particular in right to adequate housing and to safe drinking water and sanitation. It is only when all dimensions of human rights are respected will urbanization realize itself as the transformative force that it is. From an internal institutional perspective, the UN Habitat has taken several measures in pursuing its human rights mainstreaming. For example, it has finalized a program guidance note on human rights in various cities that has been distributed to all UN Habitat staff and is intended to provide guidance throughout its activities. In addition, UN Habitat has taken steps to ensure that its project cycle has an element of human rights basis by inter alia, including a human rights focal point at the meeting of the project advisory group. This project advisory group is to give specific advice and guidance on human rights issues raised by particular projects. The UN Habitat has also made strides to ensure that its programs, whatever they are trying to implement or which they have envisioned, have strong as well as positive human rights impact. Examples of human rights based UN Habitat projects include a gender focused microcredit sanitation program in the African region that provides small loans to poor households for the purpose of construction improved latrines, the integration of human rights into the global land tool network. And what is this network? Which works on access to land, tenure, security and land rights by providing technical assistance and policy advice. Also, the application of the human rights based approach to development methodology in the particular participatory slum upgrading program, which requires its 35 participating countries to review their regulatory frameworks relating to water, sanitation and housing in the light of human rights principles, and the promotion of a human rights based approach to land readjustment through the pilot project called participatory and inclusive land instruments. This pilot project seeks to protect the basic right to adequate housing beyond the framework of orthodox property and tenure rights. The UN Habitat has been particularly keen to promote gender inclusiveness and gender sensitivity in its activities as well as those of country governments. To that end, it has developed a number of guides and informational materials on the subject. They are the manuals on gender responsive urban legislation, land and governance, gender responsive risk reduction and rehabilitation, and women in post conflict settlement planning inter alia. The UN Habitat responded to this blow by issuing a statement attesting that it welcomes any constructive criticism, but it was seriously concerned about some critical omissions in the report and warned that withdrawing the funding of UN Habitat of about 7% of its agency's core budget will be in grave danger of sending a signal that well planned and managed cities do not matter. The UN Habitat further emphasized that its new executive director, Juan Clos, had embarked on an internal review process that would address some of these very concerns. Although the UN Habitat has tried desperately to give sanitation effort, housing, and despite its role in mainstreaming human rights throughout its activities, some questions and criticism of UN Habitat's approach remain. And this summarize that in 2011, for example, United Kingdom's Department of International Development DFID dealt a blow to the organization when it decided to cease funding UN Habitat, along with several other UN agencies, after a review in which it claimed to find serious problems with UN Habitat's working. And more importantly, its methods of application of these plans. In particular, although it found the UN Habitat has strong partnerships and has a satisfactory gender policy in place, DFID found that it has a number of organizational loopholes and weaknesses. These weaknesses were poor cost consciousness, absence of transparency, and results reporting. However, it is to be noted that there is little evidence suggests that the UN Habitat has been critical in delivering against UK development priorities. This is because due to the small scale and limited scale scope of its operations. As the report put it, there is no evidence that the UN Habitat is controlling administrative costs or focusing on where it can add the greatest value. The UN Habitat's strategic plan is weak. It has remained resistant to embedding results, and these results are based on management and evaluation. The UN Habitat does not operate under a presumption of disclosure. It provides some information on projects to the governing body, but does not publish full details on project performance. It is to be noted that while some reform efforts are underway, the organization's track record in improvements is not strong, and thus one gets an understanding of the success and the failure of the UN Habitat as a role of providing sanitation, water, and housing to the urban poor. Thank you.